back to another devlog. Today we will be working on enemies. The first thing I wanted was to come up with how the enemy would appear in game. For this, I decided on making a little blob on the ground that would occasionally shake, and if the player walked close enough to it, then it would spring into action. The blob's idle animation took longer than I'd like to admit, at around 20 minutes, and I'm still not 100% satisfied with it, but that can always be touched up later. I then wanted to make the animation of the blob shooting out of the ground into its activated pose, so I needed to make an animation for that. I of course started with the ending frame of the idle pose I just made. I wanted to make it kind of alien-like, where it would jump off the ground and then launch out its limbs and prepare to fight. I of course have no idea what I'm really doing, but I'm just trying to work with it as I go along with it. Once I thought the flying blob looked naturalish, I ended up tossing in my idle sprite to get a reference for what I wanted it to look like. Then, all I needed to do was clean up the transition frames from a blob with a bunch of limbs into a somewhat legible humanoid being. After that, I ended up going back and rescaling the sprites. The reason I wanted to do this is because I want the enemy to be bigger than the player. Also, I could add more details such as little particles flying off the blob as it lands or launches off the ground, or maybe even more complexity. From there, all I needed was an idle animation to set as the base for the enemy. So just like before, I grabbed the last frame from the previous animation to use as a starting point. And just like before, it took quite a while just to get something I thought would be fine. And so far, it's starting to come together. Now that's all set up for rigging, I decided to hop back to the player spawn animation. I wanted to polish a bit and make the character look less stiff as he spawned in. So to do this, I ended up using a superhero landing as the reference, and put together with the lightning, it looks a lot better than it did before. From there, I figured the best course of action would be to create some attack animations for my player, so then you at least have some way to defend yourself from whatever I end up creating. Since the player does spawn from lightning, I tried to make the attack sequence at least feel fast. I also have been toying around with the idea of the animations having that teleporting effect that you see in popular fight sequences. The first attack I wanted to be a bit slower as I want you to be able to feel the power in the attack. At least that's what I'm starting with for now. This animation in particular, I really struggled with getting the proper perspective of the player looking like they're stepping backwards. I wanted to keep the frame count low because having too long of animations that the player controls can make the buttons feel sticky or unresponsive. While keeping all of that in mind, I tried to just roll with the punches and let it look bad as I continued on other frames. And if it still bugged me a couple of frames later, I'd give it another couple of minutes before jumping back to new frames, so I can set the pose up and start to work on polishing it all together. You'll also see me trying to add new effects or change the angles on some pixels as it just isn't looking natural enough for me. But after enough messing around, I settled on something. Now the first attack seems fast and looks relatively smooth. From there, I figured I'd start to work on the next attack in the sequence and had the idea of making the player teleport during the attack. And as you can see, the idea looks just about as good as it sounds. For whatever reason, in my head this idea is still rattling around, and I feel like at some point I will figure out how to add it in without it looking super hideous. Until then, and after my frustration with that animation peaked, I thought it was time to work on some form of title screen. I'll admit, I didn't know for sure what I wanted, and I still don't. I used mainly space as a reference on Google Images and started adding stuff. I wanted to keep the title screen simple, but I also wanted it to evoke mystery. I know that all sounds vague, but I'm just trying things out and seeing what works. I first wanted to make some sort of ancient pillar on a floating piece of land in space, but it looked way too simplistic, so I tried adding cracks and more details to give the pillar more character. After that, I added rocks and stars to see if that helped. Then I toyed around with having clouds. I then ended up clearing up the line of land and making it into more of a floating chunk of landmass, and from there I struggled giving the rock the right details. I didn't want too much, but I also wanted it to be clear that it was a floating chunk of land. I tried quite a few different ways of shading the stone, and after looking up some reference images of floating islands, I feel like this is somewhat passable. My next course of action was to add a little bit of color to the pillar, just so the player knows it has to do with something. What that something is, well, yet to be determined. All in all, I feel like this will pass as a simplistic background for the start scene. Is it too simplistic still? Probably, maybe. Leave me a comment on what your opinion is, as I would truly enjoy hearing it.